Okay, everybody, welcome to Economic Geography for spring 2021. I'm, of course, Stentor Danielson. This is our first recorded lecture for our class. And so, just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about in this first lecture, first, we're going to start by defining what we mean when we talk about economics. Right? It says economic geography. So, what do we mean by economics? Then we're going to look at, in very broad terms, what are some of the forms of economic organization that we can have? How can we put together an economy? Then we're going to go into a little more detail about the specific form of economic organization that we live in, that's kind of the dominant form of economic organization in our world today, which is capitalism. So we're going to look at what exactly do we mean by capitalism? How does it differ from other possible types of economic organization? What are some of its distinctive features? And then finally, we're going to bring the geography part into it and say, what do we mean by economic geography? So, to start off, what is economics? The definition that I like for economics is that economics is the management of scarcity. Okay, so economics is the management of scarcity. So that's a much broader concept than, being like, well, economics is about money and it's about jobs and it's about GDP. Those are all parts of economics. Those are all elements to the economy that we live in. But economics is a much broader concept. It's about the management of scarcity. So scarcity, when a thing is scarce, what we mean by that is there's not as much of it as everyone would like. If everybody took as much of something as they wanted, if there's not enough to go around in that situation, then we have scarcity. So the supply of something we have is not enough to meet that sort of total demand that we might have. So if we think about something like air, in most contexts, air is not scarce. There is more than enough air for everyone's breathing needs. So most of the time, we don't need a system to manage the allocation of air, to figure out how much air who gets and how to, get more air available for people and that kind of thing. There's just so much air around us, and each of us with our own breathing, we're able to breathe in as much air as we need. Right? There's nothing creating competition between people over who gets the air. So that's, in most contexts, therefore, air's not scarce, and we don't need an economy for air. But there are contexts where air does become scarce. If we are in an enclosed environment, right? If we are on the space shuttle or we are on a submarine or something like that, where there's a fixed limited supply of air, it's possible that air may become scarce. There may not be enough of it in that enclosed space for everyone's maximum breathing needs, and then we would need some sort of economic system to figure out how to manage that scarcity of air, to figure out who got how much air. Or if someone came along and wanted to start using air for something besides just breathing. And so breathing, there's only so much air that one person can breathe in. And in most contexts, even if everyone sits there like hyperventilating, trying to breathe as much air as they can, the air is still not scarce. But if someone comes along with something else they want to do with that air that might take in way more air than just breathing does. I've come up with some sort of industrial process that's going to turn that air into some other good that I'm going to sell. Then all of a sudden that might make the air scarce, because there's plenty of air to meet everybody's breathing demand, but now suddenly we've got this gigantic additional demand for this industrial process, and now there isn't enough air for that process to take in as much air as it wants and for everybody to breathe as much as they want. And then again, we would need some sort of economic system to figure out who got to use how much air. So economics is the management of scarcity. It kicks in whenever we have something that is scarce, something where the amount of it that everybody involved would ideally like to have, if they could have as much as they want, exceeds the amount that's actually available to them. And so lots of different kinds of things can be scarce. So the easiest ones to think about, the ones that come to mind most readily as examples are goods, right? Like physical stuff that you can have, like air. But services can also be scarce. You can have not enough things people do for each other to go around. Space can be scarce. You can have not enough room to put things into. You can have a scarcity of time. You don't have enough time to do everything that you might want to do. You can have a scarcity of knowledge, right? No, we don't know enough stuff, or certain people have knowledge and other people don't. So lots of different kinds of things can be scarce. And anytime anything is scarce, no matter how concrete or how abstract it is, then some sort of economy kicks in. So scarcity is something that can be produced by both social and natural factors, and those social and natural factors can act on either the supply and or the demand side. And so it's common for us to think of scarcity as being natural, that the world just doesn't have enough stuff to go around. And certainly natural factors can cause scarcities. There are situations where nature simply does not provide very much of something, and those natural factors are a limiting kind of thing, right? Are holding the supply down enough that that you're going to get scarcity. But social factors can reduce the supply of something, right? If somebody is hoarding something and they're claiming it all for themselves, that leaves a scarcity for everybody else, right? Because somebody has taken it all, even if they haven't damaged or destroyed it, which is another way that social factors can create scarcity if you damage or destroy the thing, and therefore reduce its supply. But even just like keeping it to yourself and not letting other people have it, that reduces the supply and can create scarcity. And of course, scarcity also depends on the demand side, because for any given supply, no matter how small, if the demand is even lower, there's still no scarcity. So there was no scarcity of oil 200 years ago because nobody needed it for anything. The very few applications there were for oil were in patent medicines and stuff, and there was plenty of oil for that. There wasn't a big scarcity of it. But now our demand for oil is so huge that even now that we're producing, the supply of oil we have available to us is many, many times larger than it was a few hundred years ago. But the scarcity is worse because the demand has gone up even more, because we've built a society that depends on using a lot of energy and getting that energy in significant part from oil. So we've created this situation of scarcity by ramping our demand up so much faster than we could increase any supply of that. And oil is also a good example here because we often think of the supply of oil as being very limited by natural factors. And in a sense, that's true because, there's only so much oil down there, right? The Earth has a limited volume of oil within it based on all the geological processes that happened, hundreds of millions of years ago that created that oil. But how much of that oil is actually available to us, the amount that we can actually get and use, depends really heavily on things like the technology for drilling that we have and refining technology. Can we actually use some of the lower quality oil? Can we efficiently separate out the gasoline and all the things that we'd want to make out of it? And it also depends on the ability to get paid for extracting it. So as the price of oil goes up, more and more supplies of oil suddenly become actually available to us because it's now worth it to drill them. And if the supply of oil goes down, then suddenly certain potential oil reservoirs become non-entities because it wouldn't be worth anyone's time to try to extract that oil if it's a more expensive process that would be needed, or it's located in a more remote location that's harder to get it to the customers and those kinds of things. So scarcity is produced by both social and natural factors, and they operate on both the supply and the demand sides of things. And so when we talk about managing that scarcity, there's kind of two directions you can approach it from. So on the one hand, you can manage that scarcity by making things less scarce, by creating more of the scarce thing, getting more of it to people, or by reducing people's demand for it. If people don't need so much, then it's less scarce. And of course, you can also make things more scarce on purpose as an economic strategy if you would benefit in some way from a thing being scarce, such as being able to sell it for a lot of money to somebody if it's scarce. And then the other angle that you can approach the management of scarcity from is to make decisions about how to allocate the supply of the thing that you have. So you can make more of it, you can make people want less of it, or you can take whatever we've got and decide how to match that up, who gets how much, and who's going to have some of their demand go unfulfilled because the thing is scarce. There's not enough for everybody to have the maximum amount that they might want. So to get us thinking about some of the ways that we can organize an economic system, let's envision an example involving some pizza. So the situation that I want you to envision here is that you've decided to have a party, and we'll imagine that this is either before or after the pandemic here, when you can have lots of people over to your house and not worry about masks and all that, so that you can all eat pizza with your friends, right? So you're having this party, and you've invited a bunch of your friends, and you decide you're going to order some pizzas for the party. Then more people show up to the party than you expected. And so you've got your pizza, and you've got way more people there than you planned on when you ordered the pizza. But unfortunately now it's gotten late. The pizza shop has closed. You can't get more pizza. But you have a scarcity of pizza. You have more hungry friends than you have pizza available for them. If everybody ate pizza, there would be no leftovers, and some people would still be hungry and still would want more. So what are some of the different ways that you could decide who gets how much pizza at your party? So I would encourage you to pause this video for a minute and think about that question yourself. Jot down some answers. If you've got more hungry people at your party than you can satisfy with the amount of pizza that you have ordered, what might be some ways that you might go about allocating or making the decision of who gets how much pizza? All right, so if you've unpaused the video, I'll run through a few examples that I thought of and that have come up when I've done this little exercise in a live class in past years. Some of the different ways. You may like some of these ways. You may find others to be ones that you wouldn't go for, but some of the ways that we might allocate that pizza between the guests at your party. One is a first come, first served model. So whoever gets to the pizza table and grabs a slice first, they get it. Whoever is too slow, just going to go hungry. You could try to divide that pizza up equally among everybody. So, you've got an 8-slice pizza like we've got in the picture there, and you've got 12 friends. You could recut that pizza into 12 equal pieces and give everybody, nobody would get a full slice there, but everybody would get some. You could hold some sort of a contest. You could, say, all right, we're going to have an arm wrestling contest, or we're going to play Fortnite, and whoever wins gets pizza. Whatever contest appeals to your group of friends, and so then the winner gets the pizza, and the losers don't. You could auction it off. You could say, all right, well, this is my pizza, and so if you want some, I'll give it to the highest bidder, right? And so one person says, I'll pay you $1 for a slice of pizza, and then somebody else says, well, I'll pay you $2 for that slice of pizza, and you give it to whoever will give you the most money, or maybe they're going to offer to do favors, like I'll edit your paper if you give me a slice of pizza, and then you go until you get the best offer and give that person the pizza, and whoever didn't have the best offer is the one that's going to go hungry. You could decide to prioritize certain people. You could say, well, these are my best friends, right? My really close friends, and so they're going to get the pizza, and you other people, I don't know you very well, we don't get along, maybe I never met you, you came as a +1 of someone else that I invited, and so you don't get the pizza, or I'm going to show favoritism towards my closest friends. You could decide who needs it most, right? You could say, oh, well, I know that so and so, lost their job recently, and doesn't have a lot of money, so I want to give them, I want to make sure that they get some pizza to help them out because they're probably hungrier than the other people that are here. And then, this other person I know is doing well for themselves. They could buy all the pizza they wanted some other time, and so I'm going to prioritize the neediest person here. We could hold a lottery and do it randomly, so you can draw straws or roll dice or whatever randomizing technique you want to use. And so you're allocating it at random, and so it's based on luck. You might get lucky and get some pizza. You might be unlucky and not. So those are a bunch of different ways that we might think of to allocate this scarce pizza. And so I want to now take those and kind of formalize it and sort of put this together into a theory of forms of economic organization. What are some of in the broadest sense, the principles that we might apply to how to manage scarcity? And I'm going to propose that there are four main models that we can use to organize an economy. So for a very broad picture, general concepts of how we might manage scarcity. And so we're gonna talk about these and talk about how they show up in our modern life, because different ones of these forms of economic organization have been dominant or most important at different points in time, different societies, different places in the world. But we have elements of all of them in sort of mainstream contemporary American society. And so we can illustrate what all of these things are doing with examples that probably all of us have encountered. So these four forms of economic organization that I'm going to talk about are communal sharing, kinship, allocation by authority, and markets. So if we start with communal sharing. So in this system, you have your things that are scarce, your goods and everything else are held in a common pool. So there's some group of people that have this common pool of stuff, and the use of those, how they are employed, is determined by a collective agreement of everybody for the common good of the group. So with communal sharing, what you're doing is essentially eliminating conflicts among individuals about how to allocate this scarce resource by eliminating distinctions among individuals. We're thinking in terms of what is the good of the entire group. Now, what's the collective good, rather than what is the good of each individual in the group. So in a communal sharing kind of situation, certain individuals may lose out because we're looking at this collective or group interest. And so a contemporary example would be people having a shared bank account. So this is a common thing that a lot of couples might have. You put all your money together into a shared bank account, or you put at least a portion of it. Right? Some people sometimes have, sort of their individual personal bank account that is their money to spend as they please. But then they and their partner will have a shared account that they contribute a certain amount to. And then spending from that shared account, right? It's scarce. There's everybody pretty much can always say, "Oh, I would like to have more money." So there's a scarcity of money in that shared account, and so everyone that's sharing this account then decides together how to spend that money for the good of the group, for the good of the set of people that are sharing this money in this shared bank account. If we look at a kinship model of economic organization, the core idea of kinship is that individuals have obligations to support specific other individuals in specific ways as a result of their particular relationships with each other. So when we're talking about kinship, the title there should suggest that very often these particular relationships that people have are family relationships, right? They are relationships of being somebody's, child or parent, being their spouse, being brother or sister, or all these family kind of connections. That's not necessary. You can have kinship type relationships based on any kind of particular relationships that people have. That doesn't have to be a family sort of relationship, but that's the most common one that we see, is a family-based relationship. So when someone is a family member, then you have specific sorts of obligations to support them in specific sorts of ways, and you have particular kinds of claims that you can make on that person. And that's going to be different from somebody that you have a different sort of family relationship with. Right? What you would expect, what your obligations that you have towards your child, for example, are going to be different than your obligations toward your grandchild, or towards your niece or nephew, or towards your aunt or uncle, or towards your parent. Right? You have a different sort of obligation towards people that stand in different sorts of family relationships to you. So kinship is all about those specific personal connections that you have with a particular other person, creates a certain sort of obligation towards them. And a kinship-based economy has been probably the most common form of economic organization in terms of the length of human history. For most of human history, kinship was the primary way that economies were organized, and there are still societies in the world today that are primarily kinship-based economies, where the allocation of scarce things happens on the basis of your family relationships with other people. And so to give an example of a society with a very extensive and detailed kinship type of economic organization, if you look at a lot of indigenous groups, they very often have a lot of detailed kinship obligations, that you have very specific roles that you play with respect to people that stand in a certain sort of family relationship to you, often in a much broader way than is common among non-indigenous people in the United States. Much wider net of people that you have these kinship relationships to, and they're often very specific. So, for example, in a lot of indigenous Australian societies, they would have sort of a rule that, like, if you went out and hunted and got a kangaroo, it's not just that you should share the meat that you got with your family, it's that specific parts of that kangaroo would be owed to specific relatives. Right? So the tail would go to your brother, and the left leg would go to your mother-in-law, and those kinds of specific obligations that you would have to people that you had a particular kin relationship to. And so then it was very important when you met somebody new, somebody that wasn't already part of your kin network, to figure out what kind of relationship you had with them, to figure out what you owed them, or what you could expect from them. You had to figure out what kind of kin relationship are we going to have, right? What's our family kind of connection? And so, as I said, contemporary U.S. society is one of the societies in the grand scheme of human history that puts probably the least emphasis on kinship. Right? Kinship relationships and obligations and those things tend to be a much smaller dimension, smaller element of our economy than they've been for most human societies, but we still have kinship obligations. So the example that I chose there is children caring for their elderly parents. And so, as an example, my grandmother, my mom's mom, is in a nursing home. And so, a lot of the care she gets there is non-kin care because, she pays for being in this home, and they hire nurses and stuff. But there are still a lot of things that are done for her by my mother and her siblings, and my aunts and uncle. There is an expectation that they are going to help take care of my grandmother, that they're going to, come visit her, that they are going to, bring stuff for her, that they're going to help her stay in touch with people that she knows that aren't in the same facility that she's in. All these kinds of help that they're expected to give because they are her children. Okay? My mom does not have that same obligation to help other people in that same nursing home. There are other people in that same home that may need help just as much as my grandmother does, but my mom and my aunts and uncle don't have any special obligation to help these other people because they're not these people's kin. Right? They might do a favor for them or something, but they don't have the obligation that they have to help my grandmother, their mother, because they don't have that kinship relationship. And so, as I said, we often talk about kinship in terms of family relationships because that's the most common way that kinship type obligations get created. But you can have these kind of relationships without a family kind of nature to the relationship you have with someone. So, as an example, being a friend or colleague can create kinship type of obligations. So, for example, back when we could still go to conferences and travel, I frequently would cover a class for one of the other people in my department. So like Dr. Burkhart's going to a geology conference, and so I tell him, yeah, I will, show this movie in your class or proctor the test that your class is taking while you're away, or something like that. And so, we're not family, we're not related, but we're colleagues and we're friends. And so on that basis, there's a sort of obligation, right? He knows that he can ask me, and I feel compelled to say yes unless I have a specific conflict, right? Like if I'm teaching at that same time, I can't do it. But if I don't have a specific conflict, then I feel an obligation to help him out as a colleague and a friend. Right? But I don't just go around randomly covering classes for people, even other SRU professors that aren't in the same department. I wouldn't have that expectation. I wouldn't go to somebody in the like dance department and ask them to cover my class, even if it was just like proctoring a test, something that doesn't require special expertise in the discipline. I wouldn't go asking a dance faculty member to cover my class and proctor my test, but I would absolutely ask Dr. Burkhart or Dr. Snow or whoever else in our department, because we have that kind of special personal relationship as colleagues that will do this thing for each other. Okay, so then the next one that I want to talk about is allocation by authority. So in this case, you have a central decision maker who's going to allocate the goods or the services or whatever else our scarce thing that we're managing. Our central decision maker is going to allocate this according to some sort of criterion that they have decided is the right criterion to use to decide who gets how much of what. And there's a huge range of different criteria that the central decision maker might make use of, and a giant number of ways that they might decide to allocate it. And so you can get very different looking situations, very different looking economies just on the basis of using different criteria for how you allocate things. So I've got some examples there of criteria, types of criteria that are often used. And so one criterion is equality. So central decision makers allocating things on the basis of trying to give everybody exactly the same thing, exactly the same amount of this good or whatever it is. Right? It might be based on merit. So it might be based on people earning it in some way by demonstrating their fitness, by demonstrating their, how much they should have this thing. And what merit consists of can be a giant range of things. What thing merits getting this good? The decision maker can come up with all kinds of different things. You can get sometimes very dysfunctional societies if that merit criterion ends up being something that bears no real relationship to the good being allocated. So, for example, in Turkmenistan, jobs are allocated by the government, and one of the criteria they use is whether people have mastered the sayings in this book put together by their former president. So the former president, he was kind of a strongman dictator with a very high opinion of himself as the leader of this country. He put together this book of his supposed wisdom, and people can get jobs based not on their skills and qualifications for the job necessarily, but on how well they've mastered this book of his sayings. So that's a merit-based qualification, right? You earn this job by studying this book of Turkmenbashi's wisdom, but it's not necessarily a good criterion, right? And that leads to a lot of nepotism and people being put into jobs that they're not well suited for, and so forth. So it can be very dysfunctional, or it could be a very good merit criterion. Could allocate things according to desert, which is the noun form of the word to deserve, right? Who deserves this thing the most? You could allocate it based on need. So who needs the thing that you are allocating, right? That's like in the pizza example, who's the hungriest gets the pizza. That's a need-based allocation. And so the contemporary example here is awarding university degrees. University degrees are scarce. There's not, everybody can't just have as many university degrees as you want. And they're allocated by central authorities, which are university administrations, right? And so to get a degree from Slippery Rock University, you take a bunch of classes and your professor will allocate a grade to you based on generally speaking, and hopefully a merit-based criterion, right? Did you complete the assignments and demonstrate your knowledge of the topic and that kind of thing, right? That's a merit criterion, and we spell it out in detail when we put together a rubric. You could allocate it according to other criteria, right? You could show favoritism towards certain students. That would be frowned upon, but that could be done. You could give everybody exactly the same grade, an equality criterion. Again, probably frowned upon, but could do that. And then the university administration will put all those grades together. And if you earn good enough grades in the right combination of classes, it'll say that you now deserve this degree. And so we as a society have decided that allocation by authority is the right way to distribute university degrees, right? We're not just giving everybody a degree that wants one, and we're not handing them out to our relatives, right? If somebody found out that, say, President Barry's nephew, I don't know if he has a nephew, but hypothetically, if he has a nephew and that nephew got an SRU degree just because his uncle was our president and said, hey, my nephew should get a degree, that would be a scandal, right? We would say, no, that's not appropriate to use kinship as a basis for allocating degrees from SRU. We would also think it was a problem if degrees from SRU were being sold. If they were like, well, if you pay us enough money, you just automatically get the degree, right? You have to pay your tuition, but you don't get the degree based on simply paying money. So we wouldn't want to allocate degrees according to our last principle here, which is a market. So the basic concept of a market is that it's a system in which individuals trade things, so goods, services, knowledge, all those other things that can be scarce, and individuals trade them with each other on the basis of mutual benefit. So the basic idea of a market transaction is that I have something you want, you have something that I want, and we trade and we both feel like we are better off. So I'll skip directly, to illustrate this, skip directly to the contemporary example, which is buying gas at Sheetz. Right, so if I pull up to the pump at Sheetz, I'm making a transaction with the Sheetz Corporation where, say that I'm getting $20 worth of gas. From my point of view, I would rather have the tank of gas than have the $20. Right? Losing $20 and getting a tank of gas, I feel like I've gained something. Right? I'm better off than I was before. Sheetz feels the opposite way. They would rather have my $20 than have that tank of gas sitting in their tank there at the pump. They would rather have the $20. I would rather have the gas. We trade. We're both better off. That's the basic idea behind a market, is this trade for mutual benefit. The thing we want to keep in mind, though, about market transactions is that just because there's a mutual benefit from the immediate trade doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing to be said for the larger structure in which this is taking place. So how that trade happens and exactly what the ratio of that trade is depends a lot on the power that the different individuals have, right? So if I pull up to Sheetz and the Sheetz in Slippery Rock, and I decide that the the price that they're charging for gas seems a little high, and my cat has come to say hello, hello. Uh, as long as I've got a little bit in the tank, I could drive down the street to the pilot station, and I could get my gas there. And if I thought if they had a better price for it, or if I just felt like the Sheetz price was too much. And so Sheetz can only charge me so much before I say, not worth it, going somewhere else. As long as I have a little bit of gas in my tank to get to somewhere else to buy the gas, or if I'm willing to just do without gas. If I'm like, what, I don't need to drive around, I'm going to just park my car somewhere and walk everywhere. On the other hand, if I pull into Sheetz on the very last of my fumes, so I can't get anywhere, I just barely make it up to the pump at Sheetz, my tank is completely empty, and I have to get home, and the only way I can get home is to drive a considerable distance, then I'm in a position where Sheetz could charge me a lot more. They could charge me $40 for that same amount of gas, and I'd pay it. I would still be, assuming I actually have the money. Assuming I actually have that money, I'm not so broke that I don't even have $40 to my name. I might be willing to pay that $40. I might still feel that I'm still better off having gas rather than $40, because the alternative was going to be stuck at Sheetz forever because my car has no gas and I can't get anywhere without the car. So if I'm in a desperate situation like that, then Sheetz could take advantage of that and charge me a whole lot more money. Now, that wouldn't happen at Sheetz because they're a giant corporation who's not negotiating individual prices with individual consumers. Right? They just put a price up on the sign, and that's, program it into the pumps, and that's what you pay. But in other contexts, you might have that kind of a situation where the power that one person in the trade has allows them to get a way better deal than the other person. So that one person benefits a lot from that trade, the other person barely benefits. We see this a lot in job markets. If you are desperate for a job because you're gonna, get kicked out of your apartment and starve because you can't buy any food, if you're desperate enough for a job, you'll take a job that pays you just barely enough to survive on. You'll be willing to take it because it's still better off than not having the job at all. Whereas if you're in a position where you have lots of other options, you've got a big savings account, so you can afford to be unemployed for a while you're looking for a good job, then, or maybe you have a partner who's willing to support you and that kind of thing, then you're not so desperate. And so then an employer would have to offer you a much better deal. Right? The allocation of benefits within this trade would have to tilt more towards you if you can afford to walk away from that deal if it's not to your liking. Whereas if you're desperate, you have very little power in this situation, you'll be willing to take a deal that gives you only a very little piece of benefit and gives the other person in this trade a much bigger benefit. Right? The company doesn't have to pay you very much. They save a whole lot of money if you're desperate for this job and willing to take it for very little money. So we want to keep in mind with markets that just because there's mutual benefit doesn't mean that benefit is distributed evenly between the people involved. That the power of the different people involved in that trade can make a huge difference in what the actual terms of that trade are. So now we want to talk about capitalism. So this is a specific type of market-based system. So there's all kinds of markets that don't fall under the rubric of capitalism. There have been markets of one sort or another for as long as we have historical records going on. Right? And just about every country has some sort of market exchange that goes on as some element of their economy. But under capitalism, we have a system that is predominantly market-based. So the vast majority of our economic activity is driven by market principles rather than communal sharing or kinship or allocation by authority. And those markets are structured in a specific sort of way. So we don't want to confuse the specific nature of capitalism with this broad concept of markets. And capitalism is really characterized by the central role of capital, right? Hence the name capitalism. So in economic terms, capital is assets that can be used in economic activity. And so it's a very broad definition because there's a lot of different kinds of capital that you might have. So the sort of original kind of capital, the thing that the name was originally applied to, is financial capital, which is money. So money that you're going to invest in doing some sort of economic activity. Right? So not just the money you have in your wallet that you're going to use to buy a hot dog or whatever, but money that you're going to put towards creating more economic activity. That's financial capital. Then you've also got what's called fixed capital. So this is machinery, facilities, physical things that can be used to do some sort of economic activity. So if you have a steel factory and it's got all the equipment in it that's necessary for making steel, that's a big piece of fixed capital. And we call it fixed capital because if you have a steel factory, all you can really do with that is make steel. Right? Trying to do anything else with that would be extremely inefficient. So it's fixed. It is aimed at one specific kind of economic activity, as compared with financial capital, is also sometimes called liquid capital, because that money you could spend on a whole lot of different things. Right? If I have some money and I'm going to invest it, and I pull up a stockbroker website, I could invest that money just as easily in a steel company as in a car company, as in a company that makes sweaters for dogs. Whatever I want to invest that in, I can move that money wherever I want it. And if the dog sweater company isn't doing so well, I can sell off that stock, take that financial capital that I've gotten back, go invest it in the steel company instead. It moves around very easily like that. Fixed capital, if I've got my steel factory, I've got my dog sweater knitting machine, those can only do one thing. And so you need fixed capital, right? No amount of money is going to produce steel or dog sweaters on its own. So you need fixed capital, but it's also a lot less flexible. So you've got financial capital, you've got fixed capital, and you've got human capital. So that's skills and knowledge that people have. So the workers that run the steel factory, for example, they have skills. They know how to do this stuff. They have knowledge about steel production, right? They know when to pour the molten steel. They know, how to run the machine. I personally don't know much about the steelmaking process, so that's why I'm kind of vague on this. The dog sweater factory, the people that run that have skills and knowledge, right? They know how to operate the dog sweater knitting machine. They know how to create patterns for new kinds of sweaters and all those kinds of things. Right? That's human capital. As a student, you are hopefully building your human capital. And that's one of the things that your degree is good for, is demonstrating to people the kind of human capital that you have when you're trying to go get hired. You have social capital. So this is networks of interaction among people. And so the way to think of this is, if someone ever, if you think of someone saying, oh, I know a guy that can help you with that. That is social capital. You have connections, you know where to go, who to ask for different things. So for example, someone I know is currently looking for a new apartment because her roommates have decided not to renew the lease that she's on. And so she is employing her social capital by asking around. She knows people that can help her find a apartment that's appropriate to her. So she has a number of disabilities, so there are certain things that she needs, like she needs it to be wheelchair accessible. Right? And so she's using these networks, these people that she knows, to help her locate a appropriate apartment to move into when the current lease ends. So that's social capital. And then there's natural capital. So these are natural processes, right, non-human elements of our environment that are economically useful in some ways, that perform some sort of economic function for us. So if we have, for example, a wetland that filters the water that's coming down this river, and so that we have access to clean water downstream of that wetland for whatever we're using that water for, that's a piece of natural capital. So we have all these different kinds of capital that can be employed in some sort of economic activity. So there's two really important characteristics of capitalism that are going to influence a lot of the things that we talk about in this class, because we're talking about economic geography as it applies to the world we live in, and the world we live in is really dominated by capitalism. So two features of capitalism that are going to come up for us are first that there's reinvestment of profit, and then second that there's private ownership of capital. So I'm going to break down what each of these are all about. So we'll start with reinvestment of profits. So this is a basic dynamic that happens in a capitalist society. So you start with some capital, and in this case we're talking financial capital because it's the easiest one to talk about in this context. So you've got your money that you start out with, and you spend that money in order to produce some goods. So in the illustration I've got there, we take our money, we spend that money on building a car factory and hiring workers to work in that factory and buying raw materials, steel and aluminum and glass and everything else that goes into making a car. And we spend that money on making some cars. Then we sell those cars, and the money that we get from selling those cars is more than that original money that we put into it. Okay, so our goal is not just to make our investment back, okay, and be left with the same amount of money after that we had going in. Our goal is to get more money back. So we sell those cars and we have now more money than we had before we invested. And now we're going to take that more money, okay, so it's the amount of our initial investment plus a profit, right, plus an additional amount of money. We're going to take that new sum of money and we're going to reinvest it. We're going to spend that to build even more cars than we built the first time around. And we're going to sell those cars, and we're going to get even more profit from that, and we can make even more cars. And so every time we invest our capital, we make something, we sell it, we take the profit, the increased capital that we now have, and we invest it to make more stuff. And so in this case, what we're making here, and this is something that's very characteristic of a capitalist system, is we're making commodities. So we'll be talking a lot about commodities in this class. A commodity is simply something that's produced for the purpose of being sold. So the whole idea here with our cars, right, is we're not making those cars because we love cars so much. We're making those cars because we want to sell them to somebody else and get money for it. Right? The investor investing in that car company isn't doing it because they want to see a lot of cars made. They're doing it because they want to get profit off of the sale of those cars. And a good investor, somebody that's good at investing, will invest in whatever company is making the thing that will bring in the biggest profit, whatever that thing is that they're making. So if car companies aren't making a lot of profit, you might take your money elsewhere. And if dog sweaters are making a lot of profit, that's where you'll put your money. Regardless of what you think about dog sweaters, right? And regardless of what you think about cars, you're going to go with wherever you're going to make the most money if you're a good investor in the sense of being good at investing. So a commodity is produced purely for the purpose of being sold. So if I sit down to lunch and I make myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to eat, that's not a commodity. I'm not making that to sell it. I'm making that just for me to eat it. If I see that my colleague is hungry and I make them a sandwich as well and give it to them, that's, again, still not a commodity, not making it to sell it. Even if I give the sandwich to my colleague and they say, oh, hey, this is a great sandwich. I feel bad about eating all of your peanut butter, so here, I'm going to pay you for it. Still not a commodity because it wasn't produced in order to sell it, right? My goal of making that sandwich was to help out somebody that I saw was hungry. But if word gets around that I am a great sandwich maker and lots of people would be interested in having my sandwiches, and so I start making a whole bunch of sandwiches with the goal of selling them to people. Right? So I'm no longer thinking about sandwiches for sandwiches' sake. I'm thinking about sandwiches for the sake of all the money that I can make selling them to people who have heard how great my sandwiches are. Now those sandwiches have become a commodity. I'm making them for the purpose of getting money by selling them. I'm not making them for sandwiches' sake anymore. So because of this reinvestment of profits, capitalism requires constant growth. Capitalism always has to be growing, expanding, because you're constantly generating these profits and then looking for some place to reinvest these profits into, looking for some new economic activity. And so, if we're not producing, if we've hit the limit of how many cars we can sell, we can't reinvest that money in our car company to make more cars because there's not enough customers left for those cars. I'm going to want to invest that capital somewhere else. I'm going to find some other thing that I can invest that capital in. And there will be a crisis in our capitalist society if I can't find anywhere to invest that capital in. If there's more profit being generated than we have investment opportunities to put it into, then we have an economic crisis. And this happens every so often in the capitalist system. It goes through ups and downs, it gets overheated, and then kind of hits a wall and we crash for a while. So this is an ongoing, constant problem that capitalism's constantly having to resolve this question of where else could we invest this profit to generate yet more profit. So when we look at capitalist societies, they're really fixated on this idea of growth, and we need our economy to constantly be growing. We can't have an economy that's a steady state, that's stable. That doesn't work in capitalism. You could have maybe some other kind of economy that is steady state, and various people have created various proposals for what that could be in a kind of high-tech, high material standard of living sort of situation like we have. There are plenty of examples of stable, non-growing economies in situations like indigenous economies before colonialism, right? They weren't capitalists. They weren't focusing on growth, constantly trying to produce more and more stuff. So there's economic models that don't involve constant growth, but capitalism requires that growth. Right? We can't just stay stable. We have to be growing. GDP has to be always going up, and going up at a certain rate in order for the system to function. And so then that means that capitalism is expansive. We're constantly, let me move my face so that you can see that bullet point. Capitalism is expansive. We're constantly looking for new places to invest that profit into, new commodities to generate. So capitalism is constantly taking new dimensions of life and pulling them into the capitalist system. More and more things that used to not function on capitalist principles get pulled into capitalism. They get turned into commodities. They get turned into opportunities to invest profit and then generate more profit. And so this can happen spatially. New places get drawn into the capitalist system. So capitalism kind of began as the system that we understand it today, kind of began in Europe and spread to the Americas, spread to Africa and Asia, spread to Oceania, and it's continuing to expand into new corners of the world that were not highly engaged with the capitalist system. And it expands into different dimensions of life. More and more aspects of life, more and more things that people do are being converted from operating on some sort of other economic principles into operating on capitalist principles, turning them into opportunities where you can invest that profit and make additional profit. So as an example, recent news story here about water now being traded by stockbrokers. So just as kind of a side note here, when we talk about futures trading, what that basically means is that you are buying and selling contracts to buy a certain commodity at a certain price in the future. And the idea is this is supposed to stabilize price fluctuations. If you're buying these future contracts, you're making these pre-commitments to continuing to buy something at a certain price into the future. So just the other day, futures on water in California began to be traded in the U.S. Stock market. And so that shows that this capitalist system of investment is now taking over water in California. There was already this kind of capitalist management of water in other parts of the world, but has now come to the United States as well. And so water in California is now going to be increasingly managed in ways that are going to be based not on like providing equal amounts of water to everyone in the states, or prioritizing important industries, or all these other kinds of principles we might use, but increasingly on the basis of what's going to generate the most profit for these investors that are investing their capital into the California water system. Okay, then the other characteristic of capitalism that I mentioned is private ownership of capital. So of all these different kinds of capital, and the ownership of them could operate in different ways, right? And you could have a society in which most of that capital was owned collectively by the whole society. So you see that, for example, with land in many societies. Land is collectively owned. People don't have private land, but the whole community has this piece of land, and the community decides how to allocate that land to various economic enterprises. You could have a system in which the state, right, so the government, controls most of the capital. That would be the kind of system that you would see in like a communist society. Right? The government controls all that capital, makes the decisions about how to use it. In a capitalist society, and this is again one of the key characteristics of capitalism, is that the capital is privately owned. So individuals and corporations have that capital and decide what to do with it. So that capital must be combined with labor in order to actually produce those commodities. Capital on its own can't produce anything. You need capital plus labor. You need workers to do something. Some industries need a lot of labor and very little capital. Others use a huge amount of capital and very little labor. But in any case, there's always some sort of labor that's involved, right? You have capital and labor that you have to put together, and that capital is privately owned. Most people in a capitalist society have nothing to sell but their labor. So most people don't have capital. Capital is held by a small minority of people as well as corporations. And in a lot of cases, even if you have some capital, you need to combine that with somebody else's capital as well as your own labor in order to be productive. So the example that I've got there is if you are a driver for Uber or Lyft. Your car is a piece of capital. It's a piece of fixed capital useful in the economic activity of providing rides to people. But if you were just trying to drive around in your car and give people rides, you probably wouldn't do nearly as well as you would as a Uber driver or a Lyft driver, because it would be up to you to figure out where the customers are. And then, in big cities, sometimes that can work because there are certain places that that you can find somebody needing a ride. If you lurk around near the airport and the bus station or major hotels or those kind of things. And actually, when I was in China last summer, a number of times we got rides with these unlicensed taxis. That was basically somebody who had a car and they would just hang around places where they knew people often needed rides. And you pay this person for the ride. They're not part of any larger company or anything. So that person, owns all the capital that they need. But if you're a driver for Uber or Lyft, then you're combining your capital, the car, as well as your labor in driving it around with, say, Uber's capital of the app and the network of people to connect riders to drivers. Because, you're not just going to drive around, if I need a ride from my house, nobody's ever just going to be hanging out outside my house just in case I might need a ride. I need to call that ride, and so I need to go through a service like Uber or Lyft that will then connect me with a driver who will come pick me up. So as a driver for one of those companies, you depend on their very significant capital in the app and the system of matching drivers to riders in order to make any use of your little piece of capital that is your car. But then in this situation in which we're combining capital with labor, it's the owners of the capital who then control the profits. So even though both the capital and the labor are used to create the commodities and that generate the profits, those profits are controlled by capital. And the owners of that capital decide how to allocate those profits, where they're going to reinvest that in, how much of that they're going to pay to the people that provide the labor, etc. And so that means that you can get a significant conflict of interest. And this is a major dynamic in capitalist societies, this conflict of interest between the owners who want to reduce their labor costs, right? They want to make as much profit as they can by reducing what they have to pay for all of the elements of production, which includes labor. And in certain industries, labor is by far the largest expense. It depends on which industry you're in, but in some, labor is by far the largest expense that they have, right? The largest thing that from the owner's perspective, cuts into their profits. So they want to reduce those costs. But of course, the workers want to get paid as much as you can, right? Who doesn't want a raise at their job? And so you have this conflict of interest and therefore a sort of a power struggle. And then how that balance gets achieved, right? Where that tilts between paying the workers more, paying the workers less is going to depend on the power that each of these sides has, right? How much could the owners of the capital afford to do without that labor if the workers are demanding too much money, versus how much could those workers afford to walk away and say, well, your job's no good. If you don't pay me more, I'm going somewhere else or going on strike or whatever else. So there's this conflict of interest that it creates this kind of power struggle that's intrinsic to a system in which there's private ownership of capital that's separate from the people that are providing the labor. So now we get at the end here to finally bringing in this geographical dimension more explicitly. So these economic systems occur in places. So places shape the economic activities that are carried out there. And in turn, the economic activities shape the places that it occur in. So to kind of get into this idea, I'd like you to think about a place that you're familiar with. So probably like your hometown or something like that. Got a picture of Pittsburgh there since that's where I live, and that's the example I'll talk through after this. But I'd like you to pause the lecture for a minute and just think about the place that you're familiar with, and think about how did the characteristics of that place shape the economic activities that are going on there. Right? Think about what are the major economic activities happening in this place, how are they shaped by the other characteristics of that place, and then in turn, how have those economic activities that are going on there reshaped that place that it's happening in? Okay, so just think of one or two things to say about each of those sides of that relationship. Pause the recording for a minute, and then once you've done that, come back and I'll talk through my example. All right, so I unfortunately can't hear what you came up with for this, but I'll give you an illustration with respect to Pittsburgh here so that you can kind of compare that to what you said and kind of see if you were on the right track there. So Pittsburgh, if we think of what economic activity happens in Pittsburgh, the first one that comes to most people's mind is steel manufacturing, right? Pittsburgh is a longstanding hub of steel manufacturing. And there are a lot of aspects to the place that Pittsburgh is in that made it a hub of steel manufacturing, right? Steel companies didn't just randomly choose Pittsburgh. It has a variety of characteristics in of the place that made it suitable for that. It's where it's located relative to the supplies of iron ore and coal that are the major inputs to steel, the availability of places to build the factories, the rivers that provided good transportation corridors for the raw materials coming in and the finished products going out. And so those elements of the place of Pittsburgh shaped which economic activities that made it so that Pittsburgh became a hub of steel manufacturing as opposed to the giant range of other things, right? Pittsburgh didn't become a place where he manufactured cars, right? That wasn't our thing. That was Detroit, and they had a different place and so a different set of characteristics, and that drew the car companies to Detroit and the steel companies to Pittsburgh, right? Then that economic activity shapes the place that it occurs in. Okay? So that steel manufacturing had various impacts on Pittsburgh. So it brought a lot of people to Pittsburgh. Right? A lot of people came to Pittsburgh to work in the steel factories. So a lot of immigrants from various parts of Europe that you can still see if you look at the last names of people living in in the city. There were a lot of African Americans that came up from the South when the industrial boom was happening. So you have people coming to the city. You have a lot of things that were built with the profits from that steel manufacturing, right? The Carnegie Library System, for example. Built using the profits from Pittsburgh's industry, and the various parks in Pittsburgh were often set aside by people that had bought a bunch of land by getting rich off of the industry in Pittsburgh. It also created a lot of pollution, and so Pittsburgh became one of the most polluted cities in the country. And then those new characteristics of the places then go on to shape the next round of economic activity. So the steel industry, having been there for a while, had all of this fixed capital that was becoming outdated. You also had strong unions forming in Pittsburgh that raised the labor costs. And so eventually the steel companies started to decide that they were going to leave Pittsburgh. They were going to take their manufacturing elsewhere, to the South, to places overseas like China. And then meanwhile, you have the city trying to reinvent itself. And it said, well, we don't like this image of being this polluted, gross city. So we're going to try to clean up our act. We're going to try to focus on economic activities that don't have that dirty reputation. And so one of those, some of the big industries in Pittsburgh now, right, the things that employ a lot of people, are the technology sector and healthcare. And so the technology sector in particular was actually built on sort of the remains of the old manufacturing system, because those steel plants, they didn't just need the workers that would go in and pour the steel and move the steel bars around and those kind of things. When we think of people that work in the steel industry, right, that's the kind of people that you think about. They didn't just need that kind of work. They also needed engineers and chemists and people to develop new products and new processes for making the steel and those kinds of things. And so because of that, Pittsburgh developed this really active education sector, right? And we have the University of Pittsburgh, we have Carnegie Mellon, and various other universities in Pittsburgh. And then because those universities have been established, even after the steel industry left, we were producing now all of these highly educated graduates. And so that drew technology companies like Google to Pittsburgh. So they said, we locate here, we can easily get all these, CMU computer science grads, for example, to come work at Google. And so then that has created the new economic landscape of Pittsburgh, where technology is now one of our big sources of economic profit. So we have this constant cycle that economic activity shapes the places it's in, and then the characteristics of those places shape the way that economic activity plays out. So we're going to be spending this class diving deep into some of the specific ways that those two connections happen. So that's it for today's lesson, and I will see you next time.